All right, my friends, let's come back together. I will say, I had the question a couple of times as you all came up, the test is still Friday. Okay, the test is still Friday. It means we just lose a bit of time as far as other things we're going to do, but we still have plenty of time to get through. Again, very straightforward unit this is. I'll be honest with you. The endocrine system, the only thing that makes it seem hard is all the different hormones, and their names are always complex. Okay, so everybody thinks it's all hard. It's really not. But you should be comfortable with the gland, what hormone it produces, what that function does, right? And how it's regulated. Those are kind of your four big pieces for each of these guys. I'm sorry?
What do you mean by how it's regulated?
Well, how it's controlled. What tells it to release, what, yeah. You'll see as we go through them today. A reminder of these different types of steroidal versus non-steroidal. This is where we ended up last time we were together back on Wednesday. The steroidal hormone, right through the cell membrane, right into the nucleus, actually binds onto a protein that attaches to the DNA. And what's the point of that? Okay. What's the point of that? To make proteins, right? To make a specific protein. Okay? So protein has not been made. Steroidal hormone comes in and tells it, hey, make this hormone, please. So you're talking about anabolic steroids like for weightlifters or sports folks. You're correct, yes. It's all about the recovery and buildup of the muscle mass.
How does that break down over time? Because they say like you're going to be like decrepit when you're old.
The point is that, well, you can do some damage to joints because you're lifting and moving more things than the joint can really take. But also, if you don't keep taking it, you very quickly lose those pieces. Yeah. Sure. The point is, little bit of changes over time, your joints can get used to it. Yeah. Stay with me, friends. Moving into the non-steroidal hormones, slightly different cascade, right? Thank you. I'll wait for you. The non-steroidal binds out on the cell membrane, right? Binds to that hormone receptor on the outside, which then changes the G protein, which changes the adenylate cyclase, which then changes the proteins, right? So here's a protein that's already there. We're activating it. See the difference between we're actually creating a whole new protein with the steroidal piece, okay? And again, the question that you had in your study guide was, can you walk through how these two function, how they actually work? All right, so today we're talking about control, right? We're starting in controls, and then the plan is we'll talk about the pituitary gland hormones. If we have time to continue, we will, but I think that's as far as we're going to get today. Quick, yeah? How are they controlled? So your textbook talks about three different mechanisms. I'm here on page 306. Of how these hormones are controlled. And they're very precisely regulated. Because remember, we said hormones are super potent, right? So little bits of them can cause big changes. So three ways. Number one, you have the release of the tropic hormones from the hypothalamus that controls secretion of the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus is part of what? Like, where is it located? In the brain, even in the brain stem area, right? Okay, is this endocrine system? Hypothalamus? When did we learn about well, the nervous system, right? So this is a part of the nervous system that is actually controlling the endocrine system, right? So it has very specific effects on this anterior pituitary. We'll talk more about this as we're going today. Number two, it does also secrete, or the nervous system does affect other glands very specifically. The example it gave was the adrenal glands, over on top of the kidneys, are affected by that parasympathetic nervous system. And then number three, you've got glands that will respond to changes in the internal fluid environment. So if you are dehydrated, there are certain hormones that will kick in. If you are overhydrated, there are other hormones that will kick in. That's just one example. There's lots of different ones there. But you have kind of these three different mechanisms. And all of them rely on this negative feedback loop. Now, if you remember, that's going way back to chapter 1, where we talked about negative feedbacks. It works like this. Think about your heating system in your home, right? The last few days have been a good use of heating systems in our home. It gets too cold. What happens to the heating system? It turns on. It blows hot air, hopefully, and your house warms up. Does it just keep blowing hot air infinitely and indefinitely? No, when it gets back to the target temperature or within a degree or two, what happens to the system? It shuts off, right? That's what we call a negative feedback loop. Here's my homeostasis point that I want to maintain. When I get away from that, something happens to bring it back to homeostasis. Once I get back to homeostasis, I stop whatever it is I was doing. Does that make sense? If it gets too hot in your house, what happens? The AC kicks on, right? Hopefully not using that this week at all. But the AC kicks on, so the temperature goes back down. Does it just stay on indefinitely? No, it turns off once you get back to that target. Does that make sense? In your hormone system, this endocrine system is working very much the same way. There's glands that are very sensitive to the concentration of substances that it regulates. And so when you get outside of a certain level, it either kicks on or kicks off, depending on what's needed to get back to that normal concentration. Any questions there? Boy, I hate to say every single because there's always exceptions. But yeah, for the most part, this is how these guys are working. Right. And this little diagram is just kind of showing you that the blood concentration of whatever it is always changing. Does that make sense? There is very, very little of anything in the real world that just stays at this constant, consistent level, right? Because hormones are always being used. Hormones are always being produced. So we basically cycle between I've got not enough and I have a little too much, and not enough and a little too much. And the point is you end up with this average homeostasis level. Does that make sense? All right. Let's keep rolling then into the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, this is what we call the master gland, or the gland that really controls most of the rest of the endocrine system. It is attached in the anterior part of the brain. If you remember this diagram, right, that there was a little bit of little thing that was hanging down into the bone. There actually was a space on that same diagram that you all learned about the nervous system. That little piece hanging down there, that is the pituitary gland. There's actually a name for this little bone structure. It's like a little seat that this pituitary gland sits in. It's called the sella turcica. In Latin, that means the Turkish seat. I'm not kidding you. Okay? And that's just a place where that pituitary gland is protected. It's so important, it needs its own little seat, its own little protection area. Yep. You don't. It's just information. So it has two lobes to it, an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe, and those two lobes function in different ways. The brain is what's really controlling this pituitary gland. In specific, what part of the brain? The hypothalamus. Because it's literally right next to it. Can you see here? That this is the hypothalamus right here. And the pituitary gland comes off of the hypothalamus. So they're literally right next to each other, right? Kind of this whole area right here is hypothalamus. Yeah. There's lots of other structures you'll recognize as you read through this piece. But yes, optic chiasma, an optic nerve, and that's the piece we're talking about there. So you get these hormones from the hypothalamus. Those are called the releasing hormones. And they control the secretions of the anterior pituitary. And there's actually a set of blood vessels, little capillaries, that come right from, come on now. Here we go. that come right from that hypothalamus and drop right down into the anterior pituitary. So it's literally the hypothalamus secretes these releasing hormones, and they travel like this far, tiny little bit, from there to the anterior pituitary. So they're controlled. It's almost an immediate control of this guy. And then the posterior pituitary, wait, how do we go from posterior? We went from anterior to posterior. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, and the posterior pituitary releases the hormones into the bloodstream in response to nerve impulses. So the anterior gets its signal to release hormones through the bloodstream. Does that make sense? Blood hormones come right from the hypothalamus down into the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary, how is it controlled? The nerve impulses. It actually talks about the axons of these different tracks going through that posterior pituitary gland. Go ahead, Sinan. Mm-hmm. So I would want you to be comfortable that how both anterior and posterior are regulated in general, and then as we go through the different hormones, yes, I do want you to be comfortable with specifics there as well. Question?
So the main difference is one is by the hypothalamus and the other is nerve.
Well, they're both coming from the hypothalamus. One is nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. One is hormones being released from the hypothalamus coming in the bloodstream. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. It actually creates them. Yeah. Well, you'll see more about it. Actually, the hypothalamus creates them and stores them in the posterior, and then they get sent out. We'll talk more about that. All right, so let's talk about the anterior. And there's 5 hormones that this anterior pituitary releases, right? By the way, if you want just a nice little summary of all the pieces we're going to talk about, on page 311, there's a lovely table, 11.3, that gives you, here are the hormones, here are the actions, here are the control, like basically what I told you you need to know, right? And that's a great summary. Yes, sir. Yeah, it's a great summary. I'm not saying you have to memorize the whole entire table, but I'm saying it's a great summary of what you have to know. Yeah. So we'll start, the anterior pituitary consists mostly of epithelial tissue. These are glandular epithelial that are actually producing the hormones, okay? And there are blood vessels all around it so that as it produces these hormones, it can dump them right in the bloodstream and they can go affect the areas that it's supposed to affect. The first of those hormones is called the growth hormone. And what do you think that might stimulate? Again, very, very creatively named, right? So it's stimulating body cells to grow and to reproduce. And it also regulates the rate and speed with which the body uses the carbohydrates and fats that it takes in. So you have, from the hypothalamus, the growth hormone releasing hormone that basically tells the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary, to make more of this growth hormone. Does that make sense? Right. Growth hormone, releasing hormone. It's the hormone that says, hey, release that growth hormone. Again, I think the names are the hardest part about this chapter, is keeping straight what does what. You had a question, Joshua? No. You can also have your nutritional status can affect how much of that growth hormone is released, whether you're eating a lot or whether you're not eating a lot. Dwarfism, giantism, these are things that come from the anterior pituitary, a difficulty with this growth hormone, either too much or not enough. In dwarfism, normally the person is normal, like their body structures function right. There's not really significant difficulties there. They're just smaller. But in giantism, and it's not really the right word for it, there's a better word they use for it, you can actually have a lot of difficulties, a lot of problems And that would be caused normally from a tumor on this anterior pituitary gland that is just making it make more and more and more of this growth hormone, and you end up with somebody 8 feet tall. So theoretically, right. Yeah, probably even with the technology we have now, you probably could. Yeah, yeah. Let's keep going. The next hormone released by that anterior pituitary is prolactin. What is lactation? Milk. So pro means good, right? You're making, you're producing, right? So this is prolactin. It's the hormone that regulates milk production. Are you with me? The names usually are telling you what it does in Latin, but it does tell you, okay? Men do have prolactin. Obviously, we don't produce milk, but it does have some sort of effect. We're not quite totally understood what it does. We know it does have some effect with the other sex hormones, the testosterone, these kind of pieces, but exactly what prolactin does in the males, not well understood. So growth hormone, prolactin. Number 3 would be thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. Not TSA, those are the folks from the airports. This is TSH. So this is controlling what? The thyroid. So the thyroid stimulating hormone is controlling the thyroid. Makes sense, right? So it's basically telling the thyroid when to release its hormones. And that hormone is controlled by the thyrotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So again, it's one of those cascades. The hypothalamus releases the thyrotropin-releasing hormone that tells the anterior pituitary, hey, release that thyroid-stimulating hormone. That hormone goes to the thyroid and actually lets the thyroid produce the things that it produces. We'll learn more about that in a few moments here. And again, negative feedback loop. As blood concentration of the thyroid hormone increases, what happens to the amount of thyroid stimulating hormone? It decreases, right? Because you're trying to keep this level. If the level of those thyroid hormones goes down, what happens? You produce more of this thyroid stimulating hormone.
So all of these hormones are in the bloodstream.
They are. Yep.
What sense is like how many hormones are in the
You have different, that talks about this in the hypothalamus. Your book talked about it. I'm not sure the PowerPoint does much. But there are actual receptors for these different hormones that are part of the nervous system that recept and see how much there are.
like an island receptor?
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
So by a receptor not getting something to bind with it, it can say something to the nervous system?
Right, if it's attached to it. Yeah, it's like a control cell. Are you with me, friends? Good. A lot of other conversations happening here. I'm jealous of your lotion because my hands are very dry too. No, I appreciate it. Has a smell to it, right? Maybe. We'll see. We'll see. I appreciate it, though. My daughter always gets after me because my hands are very dry. A little bit. It's all right. Yeah, a little bit. Okay, let's come back here, friends. Shh. We've got our, this is a good view of the negative feedback loop. That's there on page 310. Just so, again, you can see. Shh. Hypothalamus is secreting the hormone to make the anterior pituitary secrete its hormone to make the thyroid secrete their hormones. Once that guy is secreted enough in the bloodstream, we see that. So therefore, you get this inhibition sent, hey, hypothalamus, hey, anterior pituitary, stop making that hormone. We don't need any more. And it'll slow down. Yes, ma'am. No, in the area that those thyroid hormones are going to. Remember, each hormone has a specific target cell it's going to. Not to the posterior. Posterior is not involved here.
No, I said.
Hypothalamus to the anterior to the thyroid. Yep. And then our fourth one is the adrenocorticotropic hormone. Boy, I would sure love some conversations to settle down here, guys. I appreciate it. Adreno. What does adreno sound like? Or what is it? The adrenal gland or adrenaline, which that's where that comes from, right? So this is the cortico, which is the outside, the cortex. So this is the hormone that controls the secretions of the adrenal cortex, the outer level of the adrenal gland, the outer layer of the adrenal gland. And that's regulated by corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. You see the pattern, right? That there's this releasing hormone that controls the anterior pituitary's hormone, which then controls the gland's hormone. Yes, ma'am. Outer layer of? Sure, that's the cortex. We will talk about, there's a difference between the outer layer and the inner layer, what they do. So we will talk about that, certainly. Yeah. And last but not least, we have the follicle-stimulating hormones and the luteinizing hormones. The follicle-stimulating hormone, this is what actually causes the ovary to develop an egg every month. The spiking in this hormone is what causes ovulation, the release of that egg every month. The luteinizing hormone is the hormone that also plays a role in that secretion and releasing of the egg. It's actually more, once the egg has been released, the little spot that the egg came from matures into this little guy that's producing lots of this luteinizing hormone. We'll talk much more about this in the reproductive system. But again, these are affecting certainly the female sex hormone, sex organs, but also males have these hormones as well. Again, exactly what they do, we're not 100% sure, but they are present. They are gonadotropins. What's a gonad? Yeah, your ovaries and testes, right? So these are hormones that are affecting the sex organs. Yes, ma'am? Because that's exactly what they call that piece where the egg is grown, for lack of a better word, is what we call a follicle. Yeah. Are we good, friends? So this is anterior pituitary, right? These 5 main hormones. Growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating, adrenocorticotropic, follicle stimulating, and luteinizing. Actually, that's 6. I can't count. You should, yes, sir. Yeah. If we move into the posterior pituitary, sir. It controls the secretions from the adrenal cortex. That's all you have to know at this point. Yeah, we'll talk about the adrenal cortex and what it does, what it produces. But this hormone is basically telling the adrenal gland, the outside of it, hey, produce your hormones.
Is that what most of these hormones are doing?
So far, yes, sir. That's all they're doing. These are all hormones that are controlling other glands. Yep. Because again, the pituitary is like the master controller of all these hormones, all these glands saying, hey, you fire. No, you stop. No, you fire.
Wait, it controls the secretion from the adrenal gland?
The adrenal cortex, which is just the outside of the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland has both an outside and an inside. They do different things. It's a good question. Okay, so our posterior pituitary, it has nerve fibers and neuroglial cells inside of it. And it's basically getting hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, which are then stored in the anterior pituitary. So remember the posterior pituitary stores them. Remember the anterior actually is producing these hormones, right? All 6 of these hormones we just talked about. The posterior is just storing them. Basically it's these sacs that are full of hormones that they store and then are released. So here are the 2 big ones that it releases. The first one is called the antidiuretic hormones. Do you know what a diuretic is? It causes you to pee more, right? So if I'm an anti-diuretic, what's that? Making you pee less, right? You want to hold on and conserve your water, right? So this is a hormone that's basically saying, no, 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 we don't pee all that water out. We need to hang on to it, right? We cool? Sure, if you're dehydrated, your body wants to hold on to your water more, right? So when we're nice and hydrated, our urine should be nice and clear. When we're dehydrated, our body has to continue to reuse that the water, and that's when you get this more concentrated yellowish urine. Sir? Mm-hmm. So no, at that point, when you actually have the signal in your head that, hey, I have to pee, it's because your bladder has reached a certain amount of stretch to it, because the bladder is made of that transitional epithelium. It's elastic. It stretches. So at that point, the filtering is done. The control of how much water is being taken out or left in happens way back up in the kidney, in the nephrons. We'll talk much more about this when we get to that system. But no, at that point, your bladder is just a holding tank. It's not actually doing any more filtrating or doing anything else with it. It's just saying, hey, I got to go to the bathroom. And if you don't go, eventually I'm gonna let go, because I can't hold it forever. Yeah. Okay? And again, the hypothalamus is the one who is regulating this, right? The amount of this stuff that's released, the amount of the ADH that's released is controlled by the hypothalamus. Last one, oxytocin is the last piece produced there by the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary gland. This is the hormone, one of the significant hormones that plays a role in childbirth by contracting the walls of the uterus. Because basically what's happening is you want those walls of the uterus to contract, squeeze, push the baby out, right? It's also the hormone that squeezes the ducts where the milk are produced in the breasts to have that milk come out toward the nipple so the baby can actually drink from it. When you're looking for, like if a lady has reached, like, or has started to dilate or whatnot, and she's not making enough contractions to get the baby out, they'll give her Pitocin is one kind, but it's this oxytocin type hormone that actually causes the contractions to get harder, to get stronger, to help that baby come out. So you are thinking of the same hormone. You're correct. One of the pieces it does, right, is help that bonding between the baby and the mother. But these are the main pieces that it does. Yeah, you're correct. Okay. So those are the posterior and anterior pituitary. I encourage you, my friends, and give me 30 seconds here before you go. The questions you all did, are you comfortable they're very similar to what we're doing here? If you actually did those questions you were studying for the test, I'd encourage you to spend more time with them. You may see things similar to that in the future. Adios.